We're very honored to have back on stage Dr. Golfo Alexopoulos to conduct a book discussion with Peter Pomerantsev, who's a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University and the author of How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. Peter was previously senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he was a director of the ARENA Initiative, a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. He previously authored 2 other books, This Is Not Propaganda, Adventures in the War Against Reality, and Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. His full bio should be on the CVEN app and also the Summit website. I'll turn the conversation over to Dr. Alexopoulos, who will facilitate discussion and take any Q&A from the audience afterwards.
Thank you, Jim. I'm really excited to discuss this book. It is captivating, it's fascinating, it's relevant, it's very timely. But I want to start by asking Peter a little bit about himself. He writes in this book and in his previous works, he weaves in biographical material, talking about how his parents dealt with the KGB in the Soviet Union, how his grandmother experienced the famine in Ukraine. So Peter, I want to ask, how has your family's experience of Soviet repression informed your work?
Completely. I often feel that I'm working in a family sort of pizzeria. My father's a writer, my mother's a TV producer, very much informed by the struggle between art and propaganda in many ways, the truths that, artistic works can provide and the ability of propaganda to control the individual and how similar those things are. So I completely grew up thinking about that in a sort of Soviet exile household full of poets who talked about politics, which, if you're from my bit of the world, is a very common confrontation. Some of the great, arts and politics and propaganda are in this very intense relationship.
So the book, which I have here, is How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. Let's talk a bit about this propagandist. Sefton Delmer is an extraordinary figure. He was head of special operations for the political warfare executive in Britain during World War II. He led Britain's secret information war against the Nazis. Tell us about him and how did you discover him?
So I've written 2 books about contemporary propaganda, and I lead a research sort of initiative that studies it. And invariably, I have people sort of turn up at my events who tell me things. And I had quite a few people come up to me saying, look, have you ever heard of Sefton Delmer? But the way they always presented him was as kind of the Allies' version of a Goebbels or contemporary Russian propaganda. So doing sneaky, covert operations of the type Russia does at us, but back at the Nazis in that case, yeah? So clandestine fake news radio stations, essentially, pouring forth a sort of a shower of pornography and hatred, but pointing it back at the Nazis. So he ran dozens of radio stations in the Second World War, which would pretend to be Nazi stations, but would kind of be criticizing the Nazis from inside. So led by supposedly unhappy Nazi officers saying Hitler isn't anti-Semitic enough and he's not bombing the British enough and he's gone soft and he's corrupt. So these kind of like operations that would subvert the Nazis from inside. So instead of preaching at them, messing with them from inside and fracturing their coalition. And I thought that was amusing and appalling and raised all sorts of ethical issues and questions of, do you become like the enemy if you imitate their tactics and all that kind of stuff. But then I started to find out more about the operation and I became intrigued. Firstly, the scope of it was remarkable. Hundreds of people working outside of London in this gorgeous country house, set among, Dutch old masters and these huge grounds full of monkeys and wild animals. an incredible combination of writers, artists, scholars, a huge amount of cabaret actors, German cabaret actors from the cabaret scene in Berlin.
And he recruited Jewish refugees and others.
So a lot of the people playing Nazis on these radio stations were Jews. Jewish refugees from the cabaret scene who were playing Nazis in order to subvert the Nazis. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And then I found out something else about the operation that made me kind of want to investigate it in a book. And that was from 1943. Delmer wanted Germans to know that this was the British cosplaying the Nazis. So not what the Russians do here when they create a fake website and you're meant to believe it's genuine. He wanted the audience to be in on it. And then I was like, oh my God, what's going on here? And then I started to read more about his past and actually his very sophisticated ideas about propaganda and the very complicated sort of psychological jujitsu that he was playing.
Before we get to his ideas about propaganda, I want to back up a little bit to his life before he did this for the British, because he worked as a journalist in Berlin. He got close to the Nazis. Tell us about that. How did he meet Hitler? How did he meet Goebbels? What was his view of these people? Tell us about that.
So Delmer was a character that I felt a lot of sort of personal connections with. He sort of grew up bicultural. I mean, sort of, as you can tell, I'm British, but my background's in Ukraine. I grew up bicultural, and so did he. He was from a British family, but grew up in Germany. He was a child during the First World War in Germany. And he writes very movingly about his childhood, where he was both bullied for being English, but was also sucked up into the pro-German propaganda of World War I and found himself kind of singing these patriotic songs and taking part in these kind of like student marches as a 10-year-old kid in support of the war against his own country. And because he always understood everybody's susceptibility to to the orgiastic crowd, to the mob, to the sort of feeling of being part of this, organism of combined emotion. Because he knew everybody, including himself, was susceptible to that, he was very sharp in understanding the power of Nazi propaganda. So he came back to Germany after having studied at Oxford. He came back to Germany to be a journalist, covered the rise of the Nazis. And he twigged very early on, when people were still laughing at Hitler because he seemed so ridiculous, that the power of Nazi propaganda was to release these pent-up frustrations, normalize anger, a kind of crowd hatred, and to bring out all the worst bits of your own personality, but under the language of patriotism. And he's very good at describing in his memoirs how he gets close to the Nazis, and how their power stems from this sort of release of pent-up emotion, the creation of a community in a time of huge change, and most interestingly, their kind of ability to give people roles to play in a world where people had lost their sense of who they were. He had a very theatrical view of human nature, and he saw the Nazis as a very successful theater troupe, in the sense that they gave people a language to use that made you feel superior. You were an Aryan, an Übermensch, compared to the rest of society, ways to speak, ways to dress, communal activities. I think Delmer would have been fascinated by social media as a propaganda tool, because that brings you into common types of behavior that welcome you into a group. The Nazis actually invented an early form of social media. They would give their soldiers cameras when they went on their invasions of France and Poland. And they were meant to take photos of themselves, selfies. And they were given special diaries with a space for the photograph. We were meant to stick the photograph in right where you'd been that day. I've just conquered Paris. Send it home. And there were reading groups, communal reading groups, to read that. So essentially Facebook. So essentially get people involved in a common activity, photograph themselves, write about it, send it to their families, get everyone to read it communally. I mean, the Nazis would have loved social media. I mean, it would have been ultimate propaganda tool for them.
You describe so well in the book the way that radio broadcasts were essential to the Nazis and how they used radio to spread their propaganda. You also link radio and social media. Could you talk a little bit about that? What similarities and differences are there between the radio broadcasts of the 20s and 30s and the use of social media today?
Sure, it's something I explore a lot more in my second book, This Is Not Propaganda, which is also outside. But look, when radio first appears, the way it's greeted is very similar to how we celebrated the early days of Facebook. So the idea was that radio would end all wars because people would be able to hear each other across borders. People would be connected. They would understand each other. And it would be the start of a wonderful new global civil society. Very similar to, I know it's hard to remember now, but this is the way we celebrated Facebook when it appeared. Connecting people across borders, empowering the citizen, all this very romantic approach to mass communication. And in both cases, very quickly, malign forces realized that they can use radio then, social media now, in very similar ways to create very malign versions of community. And look, even the debates are very similar. Just as radio appears and this sort of media revolution is happening in the 20s and 30s in Europe and America, a lot of people start doubting whether democracy is possible because there is just so much information and propaganda out there. Can democracy survive? Very similar debate we have now. So there's lots of echoes between the two. But at the end of the day, they're both about using media to create community in ways that can be positive, but can also be very, very negative. The Nazis made Germany the most sort of radio filled society in Europe. They produced cheap radios, which they put everywhere. And it was for them a way to unite the folk in their idea of the people. Jews weren't allowed to own radios, obviously.
So they believed that propaganda was especially effective when people are isolated, atomized, because propaganda provides a community for them. Can you explain how Delmer used that particular observation in his own propaganda against the Nazis?
So when you break down Delmer's counter-propaganda, he was not shy using the word propaganda for his own work. It's trying to do several things. One, it taps into the very strong emotions the Nazis were and wants to break the fascists' hold on strong emotions. So his media was full of sexual desire, really quite graphic and stunning pornography, anger, bitterness, all these very strong emotions. He wanted to break their monopoly, start to take it away from them, so they didn't get to own those feelings. Secondly, it was all about building alternative and much healthier versions of community. So if the Nazi radio focused on the folk, their idea of the people, which was defined by them, he would focus on people's loyalty as soldiers, regional, religious, but all about giving people an alternative and healthier community. And finally, it was all about giving people agency. If the Nazi theory of propaganda is that essentially you are all bits of plastiline that can be molded by the great propagandists who can take your feelings and manipulate them at will, and you are like a hypnotized crowd. That's the language they used. And they had this idea of the hypnotized mass that they could lead. While Delmer's doing the opposite. He's constantly getting people to think for themselves, to take charge of their own lives, whether that means, subverting the Nazi economy or finding ways of defecting from the front. But he's very aware that to do that, you have to launch people through a very complicated psychological process where they're ready to take control themselves and not follow the leader. He didn't do any lectures. There was nothing there about democracy dies in darkness. There's nothing like that. He hated all of that. He thought it was pointless.
Yeah, could you elaborate on that? Because he had this dispute with some of his colleagues about what constitutes effective propaganda. Could you explain that dispute?
Essentially, look, he faced frustrations that are very familiar today. He felt that the media that was trying to engage Germans was preaching to the converted. So at that point, you had exiled German liberal media, and you had the BBC German service that was broadcasting in German into Germany. And they were all trying to be very moral, say that fascism is bad, say that Hitler is bad, say that democracy is better. They had very boring lectures on the BBC about how social democracy was better for the German worker than fascism, and all this very kind of worthy, philosophically, I think, very wise and important work. But Delmer thought it was way too late for that. At this point, he starts work in 1941. Hitler is occupying all of Europe from the English Channel to the Black Sea, effectively, through proxies. The idea that at this point you could win by giving lectures about democracy was absurd. You had to climb into the dark operating theater of human emotion where Hitler had his hold, and you had to start sabotaging it.
So throughout the book, you weave in Kremlin narratives. So it's not just a book about this fascinating propagandist, but it's also a book about information war generally, and in particular, what the Kremlin does as well, and how the Kremlin's activities are analogous in many ways, similar in many ways to what the Nazis were doing. Can you talk to us about, what you observe to be the similarities and differences between Nazi propaganda and contemporary Russian propaganda?
Sure. So the book is 80% history, 20% me walking around, the war crime battlefields of Ukraine, trying to understand how the Kremlin has managed to engineer this sort of carnage, and kind of looking to Delmer for answers about what to do. So, firstly, I agree that the Nazis exist in their own category of evil, especially due to the Holocaust. But in terms of the propaganda tricks they used, the underlying methods they applied are similar to all forms of authoritarian propaganda, and Delmer thought that himself. He thought that you could see the same tricks being applied in democracies. He was very critical of Britain in World War I. He talks about East Germany and various Soviet countries. So the underlying manipulations that Nazi propaganda uses are very, very analogous to almost any other type of authoritarian propaganda. And that's the ones I mentioned, this identification with the leader who lets you, legitimizes the nastiest types of emotions, the use of a certain form of identity construction that makes you superior to others to the extent where you dehumanize them and you enable mass murder, and giving people a role to play that is fulfilling. So those are the kind of the constituent parts. I mean, every one of them is actually very, very detailed and very contradictory. I think I agree very strongly with Delmer, and the big passage in the book about it. I would reject sort of terms like brainwashing. Delmer thought that people who follow a propaganda are doing it consciously, willingly, and usually enjoy it. After the war, they will say, oh, we were lied to, we were hypnotized. But he was like, nah, they're enjoying it. He also, therefore, thought there was a chink, because if people are doing it consciously, you could catch them. You could actually try to reel them the other way. But, and I think that's true generally. People
so they
choose.
were acting to some degree, or there was
Delmer thinks that
a performative
people
element.
are always performing, even when they're in the crowd having these orgiastic experiences, they can snap out of it. Weirdly, there's a very different author who I don't bring into the book, who's controversial and annoying in many ways, called Theodore Adorno, who made a very similar remark about the fascist crowd, sort of standing in the middle of it. He was like, everybody here is acting that they're hypnotized. They're performing ecstasy. And therefore, you can actually snap them out of it again. There is actually a way of giving them a different role to play, of undermining it. Nobody is a zombie. Everybody knows everything and is doing it consciously, which is a much scarier realization than people were misled into doing terrible things. I think in today's high information environment where everybody can find the truth about anything, I think it's pretty clear that people choose to inhabit certain spaces of hate and lies.
So if you, picking up on that point, in the Soviet era, it was a more closed information space, a more monolithic propaganda, I think. The propaganda messages were more monolithic in the Soviet Union. Today, though, but people say that under Brezhnev, no one believed any Soviet propaganda. Whereas today, in a more open information environment, and I acknowledge, of course, there's massive censorship, but people can access alternative narratives through VPN and so on. And yet it appears as if they're more persuaded by Kremlin propaganda than Soviet citizens were of Soviet propaganda. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, it's become much. Look, firstly, this word belief, it's the subject of my first book. I think you have to be very careful with this word belief in the context of authoritarian systems and Russia especially. So I think when we say belief in the American context, we mean, people have studied the evidence or found some sort of creed that they fully inhabit. At a school in a democracy, you are asked from a very early age, what do you think? What do you believe about this? Our exams are based around this. In an authoritarian system, you believe whatever is needed in that moment. I love when you read focus groups in Russia after 2014. I remember reading some focus groups, and there was a lovely line there which summed it up. People were asked, do you think there are any Russian soldiers in Crimea and the Donbass? Because officially there weren't, remember? There were little green men. And the people in the focus groups were, do you mean officially? So you believe what you need to believe in order to survive at that moment, yeah? In that way, people who can flourish in the Russian system have to be pantheists. You have to believe one thing in the morning, another afternoon, another one in 3 days' time. These things can happen in democracies as well. I'm not going to elaborate, but you have to show your flexibility to power to survive. So belief, I think, is a moot word to use. Having said that, what was true is by the 70s and 80s, Soviet propaganda, which was incredibly effective in the 20s, had lost its kind of emotional mojo. It was no longer inspiring people. While the Kremlin one has got rid of all the lame ideology, no one cares about that. It is now purely hitting down onto the emotional pleasures of feeling superior, the glorification of victimhood, which then allows you to indulge in a sadism. They've extracted the psychological levers beneath the ideology, discarded the ideology, and have got very good at pressing those buttons.
But the ideology itself, what's the content of that ideology? What are the messages that are inspiring so much emotion?
The underlying ones that repeat and work are grievance. We have been victims. We are victimized. And then, almost as a kind of continuation, and we are therefore superior to others. We are both victims and we have the greatness to hurt others. So these things always come together, yeah? If you watch a Putin speech, like so many speeches like Hitler did something very similar. You start off with, we have been so humiliated by the world. We've been so put down, which appeals to everybody because everyone feels as if they've been wronged somehow. Victim and grievance narratives, everyone can kind of apply them to their own lives, irrespective of the historical context. It always works. Everybody wants to feel they're a victim. And then during a speech, Putin will become more and more aggressive, just like Hitler did. And by the end, he's like, and now we will hurt others. Now we will be the big ones. Down, down. recently done a bunch of social research with the remarkable Dr. Maria Snigavaya, who was here yesterday, and Dr. Robertson at Chapel Hill, where we tested some of those hypotheses, did a whole bunch of polling, questioning of Russian audiences. And again, we found that what really supports the war is a narrative of what some academics call sort of collective narcissism. Yeah. So ideas of identity where you are both aggrieved and superior to others. And I really think that just repeats. That's how a cult leader works. You know, you were humiliated, you were hurt all your lives, but now I will make you the most powerful one. It works every time. But then a political movement will take it to an extreme where, and therefore it's okay for us to mass murder Ukrainians. I mean, that's where it goes beyond, you know, a life coach.
So speaking of mass murder, the Russian military engaged in horrible atrocities in Ukraine. The Bucha massacre is one of those that the propagandists deny as being, you know, fake and perpetrated by the Ukrainians and not the Russians. Can you talk a little bit about this, the way that the Kremlin uses propaganda to deny its own war crimes?
Now, that's very interesting because I'm just about to publish a huge report about the legal accountability of propagandists. Thank you, Golfo. So I should add that when the war started, I helped set up something called the Reckoning Project, which is a project that brings together lawyers and journalists. The journalists collect evidence of war crimes, make stories, the journalists open cases. The lawyers open cases. So we decided to bring these two professions together in the greater cause of truth and justice. And one of the things we're looking at is the legal responsibility of propagandists, which is hard because free speech. And quite rightly, propagandists usually get off scot-free because it's hard to show the consequence of their work. So look, there's a couple of things the Russians do around war crimes. One of them is just kind of like deny it happened afterwards. That's usually after they've kind of messed up, basically. That's when they're doing that, that kind of means they're in a bad position and they're trying to mitigate what happened. So Bucha, the blowing up of the plane MH17, remember that in 2014-15, you know, you spray as much confusion as you can out there. You might be trying to do something to your own population around that, to give them some sort of excuses. But often it's about diplomacy. You know, Russia is still involved in and likes being involved in a lot of international institutions like the UN, and they can need something, some implausible deniability to just be in the room occasionally. Yeah, that's one section. That's probably not criminal. That's unpleasant and immoral and untrue, but it's probably not criminal. What's much more interesting is when they prepare the ground for a war crime. So you'll have Russian online media, often actually, not TV media, in the run-up to the bombing of a hospital, say there are Ukrainian Nazi soldiers there, in a way that seems way too coordinated with the military action for them not to understand it. And there's multiple examples of that. They did something very similar in Syria. So what we're exploring, if they are aiding and abetting in this very systemic way, specific war crimes, is there a case to build around them in the kind of area of joint criminal enterprise? I'm not the lawyer, but so there could be a way of catching them. That's different. You know, that's when you're actually preparing the crime rather than just trying to mop up afterwards.
Thank you. I want to ask about sources. I can't help, as a historian, you used multiple sources in multiple languages, Delmer's memoirs, recordings, transcripts, MI5 files. Tell us how you discovered everything. And yeah.
So I'm not a historian. This was a nonfiction writer or whatever I am, using a historical story to investigate questions that I want to know about today. And I'm very open to that in the book. I'm not treading on any historian's toes. And I don't think I'll do another history book after this. So I was very lucky. There's an incredible archivist called Lee Richards, who's been through various Freedom of Information Acts, systemically downloading the formerly classified archive of the Political Warfare Executive. So that's the British propaganda institution in World War II. So all that is, he's systematized that. So I had all those files. Then we don't have recordings of the radio shows, but hilariously, the American State Department thought that Delmer's radios, of which there were dozens, they thought they were genuine German stations. And so they faithfully transcribed them throughout the war, because part of their job was to transcribe all Nazi broadcasts. So this is at College Park. All the transcripts are at College Park. So got to spend some time
University
there.
of Maryland.
Yeah. So which is kind of hilarious, because there's notes of them kind of going, we wonder where this radio station is. And it's like, it's in London. But like, they're like, is it in Bremen? Or like, you know. So that's what was there. Delmer's memoirs were a source, but I try to highlight that they're a very unreliable source. This is a man writing and, in a sense, shaping his own legacy in his 60s. So I often point out the difference between what he wrote at the time as a journalist, because we have all his articles, I had that, and contrast them with the memoirs. So in his articles, as a journalist, when he was writing about Hitler, he was pretty damn obsequious. The amazing Herr Hitler was greeted by a wave of adoring crowds, which was his way of getting access. Like, this is the moral compromise journalists make. You know, if you want to get near the powerful, you probably have to write nice things about them. To his credit, the moment Hitler gets into power, he slams him and he gets chucked out of Germany by the Nazis. But in the 1920s, when he's like getting access to the Nazis, he writes these obsequious things, while his memoirs are like, I could see that Hitler was a horrible person right away. He didn't write about that. So there's those things you can play with. And then I did a little bit of legwork. I spent a year collecting lost and unpublished memoirs of people who'd worked there. I found 3 or 4. That was probably my only heroic historical feat, going out into the Welsh countryside to go into went saw a guy who in his basement had, some memoirs of people. And so I did a little bit of real historical work as well and found some sources which had never been used before, which was exciting. I get it. I get why it's like awesome. The hunt for archives is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it really is.
It is every cliche. As I open the file, brushing away the cobwebs, it's very exciting.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I want to ask about Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, because he features in your book as well. Tell us about him.
Oh, Fleming made all this possible. So Fleming and Delmer were friends. They traveled together to Soviet Russia. They were like-mindedly tricksterish in their thinking. So Fleming is head of naval intelligence. Well, not head. Fleming works in naval intelligence. When Delmer starts at first, he starts with one little radio show. When Delmer starts his work, Fleming immediately seizes on it. And he's the one who said, okay, we need you. He's the one who promotes and enables the work and takes it to a different level. His idea was to use these sort of broadcasts to target German sailors during the sort of U-boat war. But so Fleming is a huge part of it. He made it all possible, and he would come down to the radio stations all the time. He would write the odd pornographic script and poem or something, whatever. So he was a big part of it. Not only him, Muriel Spark, the novelist, was there as well. Very famous German cabaret artists, writers, academics. It really was a sort of star-studded cast of psychoanalysts, spies, and artists together.
So tell us about what we should be doing, because he was Delmer worked in counter-propaganda. Everybody's asking, should we be doing? What kind of propaganda should we be countering Russian propaganda with? You mentioned earlier that there is an ethical issue where we can't create lies in order to combat lies, and yet that's exactly what Delmer did. So I wonder where you fall on that and what you think we should be doing today.
So firstly with Delmer, he's operating in a situation where he's fending off a German invasion of Britain. So, ethics are always in this sort of thing contextual. So if you're Ukraine and you're fending off Russian invasion, and a deception helps stop a genocide, I think that's okay. But more broadly, what I hope emerges from the book is that actually Delmer used lies when he just couldn't find the truth. Most of his effort was a huge research gathering operation about what was life really like for German soldiers, German civilians, down to tiny detail. So he was doing phenomenal journalism, offshore journalism, we'd call it today, without having any reporters there. So he was working with partisans to collect tiny bits of information, like what kind of syphilis was happening in which brothel, which German officer had suddenly got a new car, clearly, purloined from corrupt funds. What was the state of sardines in, on the Eastern Front, like tiny little details, yeah? So actually his strength came from the research that he did and his ability to sort of tell German civilians and soldiers, I know your life better than the Nazis, yeah? That's what he was saying. That's what he wanted them to know this was actually the British. We know your life better than the Nazis. We know your frustrations better than the Nazis. We can even imitate, yeah, their nasty attitudes, almost mocking them. So if we understand you better than the Nazis, do you really need them to look after you? Was actually the deeper argument he was making. And if we take that insight, which is the real insight from his work, then I think it's very applicable. It's always been, sad to me, frankly, that when the invasion of Ukraine started, there was nobody with the means to launch a full media, not a campaign, but actually a full-on huge media targeted at Russian soldiers and their families. It's a no-brainer for me.
What would you have said? Sure.
So firstly, it would not have been like the BBC or anything like that. So it would have been all about their lives. We now have ways of knowing about their lives to an extent that was not possible at all in Delmer's time through social listening, online hacks. It wouldn't even be focused on how evil Putin is. That's far away from people. It's like how your officer is stealing the funds that were meant to go to you. It would really press down on the many tensions in the army, which are multiple, and so on and so forth. And it would be tabloid. It would be full of the sort of content which soldiers like. That for me is a no-brainer. It wouldn't need to be covert in the sense of pretending to be something that it isn't. It would have to give people enough security to tune into it. So if your officer walks in, you can say, well, I thought this was a Russian station. I had no idea it was done by the Allies. So you need to think about people's security, but you're not trying to con them. You're not trying to sort of deceive them. Quite the opposite. You want to say, look, we know more about your lives than the Kremlin does. So that for me is a no-brainer, but the Ukrainians actually, I think, have done a lot of innovative things. They can't talk about it very publicly. I think after the war, the Ukrainians will be very happy to share with their allies everything they've learned in this war, which will be very useful to their allies, including all the incredible technological and other military innovations. But we'll probably have to wait until the war ends. I go to Kyiv all the time. One hears very cool stories about various kinds of fun initiatives. But the Ukrainians don't have the means to do this at scale. I'm not talking about PSYOPs. At the moment, we think PSYOPs are PSYOPs, and obviously the military does them, and they claim they're good, and nobody ever believes them. And then there's sort of media, which is, very worthy. There's this huge space in the middle. You've got to understand, Delmer wasn't doing PSYOPs. Delmer was doing cultural change. 40% of German soldiers listened to his radio. His radios were among the top 3 most listened to ones in major German cities. We're not talking about a little operation to kind of confuse people. We're talking about major cultural shifts. That's what he was going for. And, he could do it.
Well, let's turn now to audience questions. I'll start with, where do you see misinformation going in the future of war based on the Ukrainian war lessons learned and current global trends?
So I'd rather look at what it's a very good question. Firstly, I don't think the term misinformation, you probably mean disinformation right now, as in purposeful. deception activities, I don't find it's very useful, frankly. Disinformation defined in that narrow way is only a tiny bit of what is done. Often, it's about exploiting cleavages in society or morale, but you don't even have to use disinformation for that. So I think defining it as disinformation is already a little bit confusing and inaccurate. Sometimes you hear talks of malign influence operations. I quite like the term propaganda, but I think it's already a mistake to talk about it as disinformation being the problem. Yeah, it's all types of influence. Look, I think what we often miss and what the Russians get is that we tend to think about information separately from all the other types of influence. Russian information psychological warfare includes all activity, informational, media, corruption, sometimes cyber. They have different manuals on that, and so on and so forth. Yeah, they see it as one spectrum. And I think, look, the thing that we have to be very aware of right now is the combination of cyber and propaganda. Yeah. So let's say, well, look at the stuff they were doing in the US. Hacking into and disabling oil pipelines, using their proxies, because you work through proxies, to disable water utilities in Texas and Tennessee. It's nonstop cyber onslaught onto America, which is then followed up with informational activities. Yeah, you can't trust your water facilities, you can't trust your public officials. So I think that combination of cyber and info operations is something that is very, very current and is a way of really destabilizing societies.
Okay, our next question compares, can you compare the orgy of propaganda in Nazi Germany with what is going on in Russia today? I think we covered that, didn't we? Do you want to say anything more about?
I'm interested by the use of the word orgy.
Yeah. In quotation marks, but nonetheless used.
Yeah, I think there's lots. I think one has to be very careful in those comparisons. As I insist, the Nazis do exist in their own category of evil because of the Holocaust, but the other stuff the Nazis were doing is fairly typical.
How do you define political propaganda?
So in the book, I use the definitions provided by Jacques Ellul. Jacques Ellul is a grumpy French philosopher who largely wrote in the 50s and 60s. I think he's still written the best kind of philosophical set of definitions around propaganda. And I used them in this book. So he looked at it the following way. He defined political propaganda as the kind of propaganda that we all refer to. So, election campaigns or the sort of stuff that Delmer was doing, radio shows during a war. Something which is consciously designed to have a mass influence. Usually propaganda is designed as, the ability to use usually technology to influence a large group of people in your interests. But that was the simple level. Then he talked about sociological propaganda. And that is the much deeper types of ways of integrating a society, that bring it together, and that people often do unthinkingly. So he actually focused on America a lot, ideas like the American dream as an idea that brings everybody together. Now, Ellul's argument is that a complicated society where people don't know each other, that is united through technology, will always have that kind of sociological propaganda. That's not a bad thing. That just is. Community is defined by technological communication in a society where we don't meet each other. It's not a village anymore, or even like a few states. It's a vast continent in America's case. So you have to have, ideas like the American dream, the American way of life, TV shows that endlessly repeat these tropes for a society to be. He's not saying that's negative. What he says is negative is when people aren't criticizing and reflecting on that. When it becomes like this frightened belief, which comes out of a sense of loneliness and stability, and when this kind of sociological propaganda becomes a kind of a zealous, uncritical, unifying but really quite aggressive set of contacts. He then goes on, but I think that distinction is quite useful. And there's many levels of interaction between the two. Ellul's idea was political propaganda can never work if it goes against the sociological propaganda. Yeah. So if one of the biggest stories in America has always been about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that anybody can make it, maybe that's the reason why a lot of kind of like, lefties in America are always telling me how depressed they are that Americans won't listen to, ideas about redistribution. And Ellul would have argued because that goes against a starting myth in America that everybody can make it. I mean, that's not my argument. That's how he would say why political and sociological propaganda have to work together always.
I want to ask about a moment in the book where Delmer is describing the sadness, or actually this is part of his broadcast, that he's broadcasting the sadness of German soldiers at the imminent loss of their country. So their country is about to lose, they recognize this, and there's this incredible sadness about it. Even if they don't like the Nazis or think the party is corrupt, or there's still, and he describes being moved by this or sympathetic. And it reminded me of comments that I've heard about Russian emigres, people who fled the the partial mobilization, and who aren't particularly supportive of Putin, but they don't want their country to lose. So I wonder, what else can we offer them? Russia in particular. What else, if loss is so devastating, there has to be something positive about Russia losing the war in Ukraine that can somehow help build a democratic Russia. Do you know what I mean? Because
sure.
if it's all,
let's see that this is a very, there's a very vibrant debate about this inside, the Russian non-Putin supporters. And it's always existed. I'm not the biggest expert on it, but some points of discussion that are brought to mind. There was the idea of liberal imperialism, which Chubais, who's a former senior official who left at the time of the invasion, used to promote. I remember ages ago when I lived in Russia, he was writing about it a lot, that Russia would be a benign empire and that countries around it like Ukraine would want to be part of Russia because it would have a flourishing economy and et cetera, et cetera. So that idea is very fashionable. I don't know if it's one we want to support or promote, but that exists as a kind of weight. The other one is that Russia will become a normal European country, so it would give up its aspirations to be an empire. That was very much promoted at times by Alexei Navalny. That was often connected to an ethnic nationalist agenda, so Russia should cut off the Caucasus, all these non-ethnic Russian parts as well. That tradition was also always very confused about Belarus and Ukraine. Should they be part of this Russian nationalism? That's where it gets a little bit confusing. So those are a couple of the counter ideas that have been put forward. We are so far away from that. At the moment, we're watching Putin's total triumph. So I'm not entirely sure that that's a relevant conversation.
Do you think that civil society or NGOs or the military should be most focused on counter propaganda, or do you think they all have to work together?
Military, who are the other people?
NGOs, civil society.
It's a really good question. So a country like Ukraine, one of the remarkable lessons from Ukraine has been the way kind of civic groups, journalists, tech guys, security services all jumped in together to create this kind of civic information resistance to Russian psyops, to Russian propaganda, and do operations back into Russia. We live in a networked world, and whoever facilitates networks better wins. I just don't think we are in the Second World War, where you can have like the government political warfare executive, which controls all the radio frequencies, doing their thing, or like in the Cold War, when it could really be state media battling other state media. We live in a network world. So that means thinking about the role of the platforms. That means thinking about the role of everybody, because everybody is now a little propagandist online. Every one of us is doing some sort of campaign, at least of themselves, on social media. So individuals have a huge role to play. States obviously is still very, very influential, and so on. So the more we think about how we leverage those networks, and what our networks are, we kind of know what the Russian networks are and the authoritarian networks are. It's a bit of state media, it's oligarch media, it's these weird troll farms who are kind of PR companies, essentially. It's these bizarre networks of Telegram influencers, and they're all not totally co-opted by the Kremlin. They are kind of influenced and in various types of relationships with them. Ultimately, of course, it's a centralized system, but there's a huge amount of fluidity there, and that's what makes it quite effective. We have to start thinking what our networks are going to be. I certainly don't think we need to have the same ones. We don't need troll farms or sort of these very sort of like deeply manipulated online platforms. But we have to start thinking, how do we have our own networks?
So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk, just to say some final words about the book, about your thoughts on propaganda, about the challenges that we face today in dealing with fake news and embrace of conspiracy theories and untruths. Final thoughts.
Listen, I mean, I don't know about who we are anymore, frankly. I think that's been the theme of our last 2 days, that there's a real questioning of whether we can still think about the West in a coherent way. But I think we do have to understand the gravity of the challenge. This isn't about disinformation or Russian propaganda or any one of these symptoms of a much bigger issue, which is a sort of systemic disintegration of the democratic public sphere. My second book was all about that. All the assumptions that we had about the relationship between information and democracy have broken down. We thought more content would lead to better democracy. It clearly doesn't automatically. We thought that pluralism was better for debate. It leads to crazy polarization where, the spirit of the Madison Constitution is broken down. We thought a lot of things that were true in the 20th century and simply aren't as simple as we thought. And we really have to grapple with that. And that means questioning the small role of regulation, the role of tech platforms in shaping the national conversations and the international conversations, but also how media operate. Media, especially in the US, operate on the principle of riling up your crowd. Riling them up, and every newspaper and every media will rile up its own crowd, and then they all get into Congress together and they debate, and then they come to a conclusion. That logic is broken down. So what is the role of media in ensuring that we have a public debate that leads to democratic processes? So a lot of thinking has to happen, and some vast reevaluation, and that'll take vast investment where I don't think we've really kind of faced up to that.
Thank you. Peter Pomerantsev, author of How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. Thank you so much.